Welcome back to the Stan Thin Show. Honest conversations with founders, executives, and operators about what actually drives growth. My guest today has spent decades at the intersection of international education, media, and policy. He's the founder of the Koala News, one of the Australia's most respected independent voices in the international student space, and has held senior leadership roles at some of the country's biggest universities, including UniSA, Curtin, and Murdoch. He's an IEEE Excellence Award winner. He's been quoted in the AFR and on the ABC. And if you've worked in the Australian international education at any point in the last 15 years, there's a good chance his work has shaped the conversation you were part of. Dirk, welcome to the show. Dirk, for anyone who hasn't come across your work before, tell us who you are and what the Koala News actually does.
Yeah, look, thanks very much for having me, Stan. It's wonderful to be with you, and congrats on everything that you're doing with this channel. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so look, the Koala News is, I guess, an independent international education media outlet. It started probably a little bit under 3 years ago, so we're coming up to our third birthday, and which is amazing. Yeah,
Wow.
it's yeah, thank you. It's been an amazing journey, and to still be here 3 years after we started is a pretty good thing. How did I get here? Wow, it's a really good question. So my background is generally international education. I when I graduated from university, I started working for a vice chancellor at Western Sydney University, and so I probably was introduced to education from a fairly young age, and probably from a point of view of really fortunate to have an experience where I worked in an area that I got to see the entire university operations, in my first job. So, from how academic senate works to the board of governors or board of trustees to, how curriculum's developed, everything. So it probably put me in a fairly unique spot. I worked there for about a year and a half, and my boss at the time was a guy called Stephen Matchett, Stephen ran Campus Morning Mail. And I'll come back to this a bit later because it's important. But Stephen said to me one day, he said, Mulder, you're a smart kid, but you need to get out and go and see the world. And he was right. There's no doubt about it. So yeah, I ended up spending 3 years abroad and worked some summer camps in the United States and played a little bit of rugby between the UK, Canada, and the USA, and just generally took 3 years out to explore the world and do all of those things. And so serendipitously, I guess, when I returned, I'd just been living in Toronto, and unfortunately, I broke my shoulder playing rugby, and so it was time to come home. And Western Sydney University had a maternity leave position going, looking after, ironically, the Americas. And at the time, such a big focus was the arts and technology colleges in Ontario. And having just lived in Toronto, it was kind of that, my living experience of having been in market or in country, combined with my knowledge of the university and I was also involved in the student union. So, kind of knew the university really well. I was fortunate to get that job. And so I've been in international education since 2003. And I just love it. Like for me, it's always been a sector that, from, without sounding too silly, from first touch point, I'd be in market meeting kids with their families and guiding them through the application process, talking to them about programs, talking about how life is in Australia, to see then, and I say kids, they're not kids, they're young adults, to see them arrive into Australia. And, and I did this for a couple of different universities, but to see them arrive and then, see them at orientation and say, hey, how are you? How's your mum? And, everyone's got like a unique kind of ability, but for me, it was always remembering names and things like that. So I generally was pretty good at remembering, where I may have met somebody. So, being able to say, how's your mum and dad? What's going on? You made it, fantastic. If you need any help, come and see me. I know there's student support services, but I'm here for you. And so I just love that element of it, that it is, at the core of it, it is business, right? There is money exchange, there's a transaction. But there's a real positive outcome from both, the student point of view, because they're bettering their lives. They're looking at, a degree that is portable, they can take anywhere in the world, to the institution that diversifies their student base and obviously, diversifies their income stream in a time where, government funding was decreasing. So I absolutely loved it. So I did that for a number of years, and then probably popped out of the sector. And when I say popped out of the sector, I worked for Allianz Insurance, which was involved in OSHC for international students. And that was great. And I saw the sector through a very different lens, I guess, there, but great experience and probably a lot more commercial than what I was probably used to. And then COVID kind of hit, and I started consulting, and COVID hit. And in the background, Stephen Matchett, who ran Campus Morning Mail, had contacted me and said, Mulder, you know about international. Do you fancy writing for me?
Wow.
So so I was writing for Campus Morning Mail already. And COVID had kind of hit, and things were a bit. So Stephen had basically rung me one day and said, I'm going to wrap up Campus Morning Mail. I don't think we're going to do this anymore. So that was kind of the genesis of the Koala. And there was one focal point where I had dinner with a guy called James Martin. And if you're based in Adelaide now, if you haven't already met James, I highly recommend it. James is a great guy. He runs, I think he runs Insider Studios now. And we had dinner, and I told him about it. I'm like, mate, I really enjoy the writing. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do. Yeah. And he said, do something yourself. Yeah. And I was like, I don't know. Stephen covers a lot of, enterprise bargaining. And he said, don't do that. Just concentrate on what you're good at. You're good at it. Just keep doing that. So I kind of literally on the train on the way home just started kind of Googling a business plan for a media outlet, and figured out that it wasn't too expensive to get up, but there was a lot of time involved. So kind of put together a 10-year plan, and ironically, 10-year plan, a 3-year plan, and with a lofty ambition of getting 10,000 followers. And mate, I'm pleased to not announced, but I'm pleased to tell you I'm about 200 off of 10,000. So
amazing! Congratulations!
I'm right on track with that. So it's amazing. It's phenomenal, and it's been great.
Just for our viewers, people who are listening, Koala News is the benchmark everybody goes to in terms of understanding what's happening around in international education. And Dirk's the guy who's super nice, responds to every email. And it's kind enough to put your story on Koala News. Koala News is the one that you go to. Moving on, Dirk, I mean, you've had such an impactful ideas and vision on international education. What do you think about this $48 billion machine? International education is Australia's 4th largest export, bigger than the beef, better than the wheat. Yet it still comes after a lot of scrutiny, right? There's an afterthought politically. Why does the sector struggle to get recognition its economic contributions deserves?
Yeah, but it's a really good question. It's one that, people within the sector really struggle with as well. Why is it that we really struggle to get traction in government? Why is it we get traction? We struggle to get traction in the community. And I think it comes down to the fact that it's a services sector, and it's a services sector that the average Australian and the average politician, if I can be honest, doesn't really understand. So, and it's a very complex one. So, when you think about visas to, it's a very, very complex sector. So last year at the AIEC, there was a session that was run called barbecue conversations.
Oh, yeah.
And it's one that I've spoken about quite a lot, because I think this is one of the things. And, when I even meet people in my own sector, and, I'm like, for the first time, and I say, oh, well, what do you do? And they're like, oh, I'm in international education. And I say, oh, phew, I don't have to explain it to you. Yeah. Because, you go to a barbecue with friends, or you go to a barbecue with relatives, and they go, what do you do? And I'm like, well, I'm the international director at such and such university. And the immediate response is that like an exchange program? And so there's no sense of the fact that, people from overseas are paying, good money to be educated at premium universities globally. Like Australia has one of the strongest education systems in the world. And there's just no sense that and the value of education, I think, in this country probably isn't as high as what it is in many, many parts, particularly in Asia. Right. But also Africa and all the rest. So, if 10 years ago, if you were from, pretty much anywhere in Asia or Africa, or Latin America for that matter, if you had a degree from the United States and you returned home, that meant that you were in a different, I don't want to say different class, but you were unique in the marketplace by having something like that. And in Australia, our sense of education is, well, you just go to uni and get your degree, and that's okay. Yeah. And so I think we're really blessed with education in this country, more so than other parts of the world. And the average person just doesn't understand the premium that is on education in other cultures. It's phenomenal. The other thing is, like I said, I don't think many politicians actually understand our sector either. So what I've really noticed over the last few years is particularly the last few years, is that politicians love to shorten everything into a soundbite. And I think international education is really difficult to do that with. because there's so many contributing factors. Is it a migration angle? Is it an education angle? Is it an English language angle? So it's really hard to bring it together in that one sentence that says this is really, really good. Then you got the complexity of, well, how do you actually measure it? And you said 48 billion. I think the ABS came out with some stats last week. I think it's now gone up to 55 billion, even though commencements are coming down. So again, the value of the sector to the economy is so important. But again, it's just seen as I don't know, like it's not, it just doesn't have a value on from that sense.
A lot of people don't understand how valuable and how blessed we are to have international education as an export. So how does it come into a narrative that bringing international education or taking international education as an export really harms the economy rather benefit it? Where does this narrative come from?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess in many respects it's hidden. So it's hard. Let me flip that answer. English Australia did some amazing research prior to the last election, and what they did was look at international student economic contribution. I know this is pretty raw stuff, but international student economic contribution by electorate. And it was phenomenal. Like, you're talking the electorate of Sydney and the electorate of Melbourne, the electorate around the Bay in Melbourne. I mean, we're talking, I want to say it was 1.2 billion in Sydney. Like, we're talking massive economic contribution, but nobody, like, it's hidden. So I think there's a lack of research in that area. And given that there's a lack of research, there's a lack of understanding. So, and representation in that space is possibly not as strong as what it could be. However, there's a real risk, because in the sector, we don't like talking about economic contribution. We like talking about educating students. And there's a real balance towards that, because we don't want to give off the impression that, and that's even maybe the wrong phrasing. We don't want the concentration to be on the economic output. We want to make sure that we've got a good policy environment for students to come here and succeed. And what I've always said is, if you manage a program or if you manage a policy on a spreadsheet and you're looking at the numbers, the policy's bound to fail, because you want to tweak the numbers all the time.
Exactly.
But if you get the policy settings right, the numbers will take care of themselves. And I think that's probably the approach that the sector's taken for a very long time. Unfortunately, it's probably been a bit of an Achilles heel for us at times.
I know. So my next part is towards that particular segment as well. So, which is the students' cap saga. So we've seen a lot of political back and forth, the impact on the institutions. What did the student caps debate reveal about how government actually sees the sector, and what did the institutions get right and wrong in their response to it?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's such a complex answer, a complex question to answer. When you start at the top level, I think most of this is driven by political pressure. So when you think about, there's a lot of people out there that are saying there are too many migrants, and that the migrants are, or the increase in migration is putting pressure on our housing system. It's putting pressure on our quality of life. It's putting pressure in a whole load of areas. I would argue that it does, but it's minimal compared to the contribution that students make. And so I'll cut that a couple of different ways. So when the government first came to power, there was still this big input of, we need students back. And we had a visa regime which was pretty open. Grant rates were up at 98, 99%. It was good. And then suddenly became this narrative where I think the Liberal Party started challenging the Labor Party, the government of the time, around migration and mass migration. And we started hearing these terms called NOM. Like, we'd never heard of the NOM prior to COVID, net overseas migration. What's that? And so we started looking at temporary visas. And if you look at the array of temporary visas, international students at the moment are somewhere between 20 and 25% of all temporary visas.
Yeah.
New Zealand citizens are about 31%. So New Zealand citizens, when they migrate here or when they come to visit from New Zealand, and we have a treaty with New Zealand, so they're very welcome. I'm not like I'm trying to say New Zealand is a bad, but when we look at where international education sits in the broader scheme of things, we're less than a quarter of what the temporary migration or what the NOM actually contains. But it's an easy hit for government, right? Government can say international students, well, A, they don't vote, so we're not losing out on that stretch. B, there's this narrative that's been created around quality of education in Australian universities, and we've seen the media over the last sort of 12 to 18 months really hit hard at universities. There's been exposés on poor English language. There's been exposés on universities mismanaging things. So there's been a real attack on educational institutions right across the breadth. So I think it fits well into that narrative that, university, we need to fix this education space because it's losing the social license. And you say that enough and people will start believing it. I would argue that we've, as a group of Australian universities, and I want to say there's 37 public universities plus a number of private or semi-private institutions around the country, we've never as a group been ranked better than what we have now. We're I think we've got 3 or 4 in the top 100 in the world, and a lot of that comes down to research output, which of course is being utilised by the fees and the income that the universities draw upon, and there's no lie about the fact that international students have contributed to that.
Of course.
And they've done it in an environment where, I think George Williams said on an ABC story the other day that, 10 years ago, universities were funded 80% by the Australian government. They're now funded 40% by the Australian government.
Exactly.
So when you look at an institution and how they derive income, how they draw income, they've expanded, alternative income streams. And that's really important for them to continue to do high-level research, to continue to be ranked well, and all the rest. What I fear is, as these things all come together, is that overall funding to universities will decrease. There's levers being put on all of that, and then something's got to give. And what's going to give? Potentially it'll be research output. Potentially it'll be quality of servicing of students. Exactly. Potentially it will be the quality in the classroom. Potentially it'll be quality across the board. So I think we're heading to a point which is a really difficult one where, the stars are going to intersect and something's got to give.
Yeah, on that point, Dirk, so that is where Koala's role is really important. How did Koala News become the go-to voice for the entire international education industry? And what that says about the gap in the mainstream media coverage of international education?
Yeah, firstly, you're very kind. I don't know that. I wouldn't necessarily categorize it that way. But
the reason I say that, Dirk, is because you were the first one. And it says, let me give you a context behind this question. So the context behind this question is because I was working with one of the organizations which deals with the unis and the migration part of it. And the founder came to me and he was like, okay, you know what? This is the guide. This is the benchmark. Go to Dirk, and this is Koala News. Everything that happens, and it's verified information. Everything that we understand about and make policies within the organization is directly has an impact on what Dirk shares on Koala News. And that is how I came to know how impactful Koala News was. And that's not just, and this is just one instance. I've heard multiple agencies saying the same thing, and they kind of, they really want to get a grasp of you. And, you've been kind to me, so I get to have a podcast with you. So, coming back to the question again, yes, how did Koala be?
Look,
my voice.
I think maybe it's a timing thing, maybe more than anything. Look, what I would say is when I started writing for Campus Morning Mail, a lot of the feedback that I got was, oh my gosh, it's great to have somebody who actually understands the nuance of the sector. And so it goes back to that complexity. When you've got a journalist who might write for a mainstream paper or, online for a major news outlet, one day they're writing about, kindergarten education or early childhood education. The next minute they're writing about international education. The next minute they might be writing about finance.
Yeah.
So they're writing, and one of the things that I've noticed, I think, becoming more involved in I don't want to say journalism, but in media is the way that the media machine works. And I think if I've brought anything, and it's a unique perspective because for my friends and people who know me, I don't mind sharing my opinions every now and then. But the feedback that I got was it's nice to have somebody who knows, say, the difference between an offer and a conditional offer, exactly. An enrollment versus a commencement. Because often you'd read things in these major papers, and while the way the wind blows was probably okay, the nuance of the story just didn't hit home for people in the sector. So I think there's probably something about that within it. And I think, clearly I love what I do. I love the sector. So, where I can, and, this is kind of the Koala's motto, where I can, I want to champion the good things that we do and be able to spread the word on those. I think having a diversity of opinions is really important. So, the people that contribute, like Tracy Harris is a major contributor. They're people who I've been good friends with for a very, very long time, and I value their opinions. And so having a diverse view of opinions is really important as well. So it's not just me spruiking my own opinion, but having a diverse view of set of opinions, and then
Yes.
being able to reflect that back to people who have busy jobs themselves. So being able to receive and have a one-stop shop for information flow around international education, I think is probably where the Koala sits the best. And again, you're very kind, mate.
No, I mean,
It's
it
very nice.
is, and kudos to your work. I mean, our voice is heard. A lot of people thank you for that particular part, and Koala for that matter, bringing their voice up. Just taking the idea when we decided to record this podcast. It was not a question that I wanted to ask, but something changed last night, and Doc's been smiling about it. I know where I'm going to. So, what do you think about the last night's budget? Where is it heading, and what it means for immigration?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think the government's going to continue to put the screws on migration, and clearly, I mean, it's bigger than just the budget, right? Like there's something going on in society at the moment, and if we think about last weekend, the Farrer by-election, so Farrer is obviously a seat that covers Albury and that area. I want to say the Liberals haven't lost that seat, or they've had that seat for 60 years. And for One Nation to win their first ever lower house, I think it says something about the political climate at the moment and what voters are saying. I don't think voters are engaged with either major party the way they were probably 15, 20 years ago. And we saw that with the rise of the Teal movement in the previous election. We're now seeing it through One Nation. I think if I go out on a limb, I think the two major parties are too interested in beating each other up than what they are in actually governing the country at the moment. So when you have somebody come in and with a fresh perspective, I'm not saying it's a right perspective, but with a fresh voice, I think people are fed up with the political system at the moment. So that then puts pressure, because all of these political strategists are sitting there going, well, why are they getting the air? And what are their policies? And what are they putting pressure on us? And they do polling in the background, and all of these things happen. And then what ends up happening is a policy develops out of all that information. And where we're heading at the moment, in my opinion, is just a race to the bottom of migration, which is really unfortunate. I would really love to see a political party stand up and say, actually, you know what? Migration done well is a really good thing. And we should be backing it. We should be backing our universities. We should be backing our private vocational colleges. We should be backing our ELICOS sector. And we should be looking at developing talent in this country into our skilled systems. And skilled was mentioned last night in the budget, and there's some money thrown around that. But getting back to answer your question directly, look, the headline out of this, and we'll see this flow on from here, but the NOM limits, if you want to put it that way, or the NOM will go down from this year of 245,000 to 225,000. So there's been a reduction in net overseas migration. Now, again, that's the top line. We're yet to see what the policies will be around how you say the caps or the allocations, as the government would say. I would suspect that we will now see a lowering of those allocations to meet that target. And again, I find that very disappointing, given the fact that international students are only are less than 25% of the entire net overseas migration area. So again, I think it's a bit of an easy hit. It's probably the one lever that the government can pull, but we'll see how things go. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how things pan out over the next 6 months.
Yeah, and then that brings me to the next question: where the growth is. I mean, like, we have traditional markets, for example. There's been a lot of organic markets in terms of Asia. We've got India, we've got Nepal, Sri Lanka, but we've seen a recent shift towards Africa. Where are the markets shifting to, and are the other unis or institutions prepared for that?
Stan, I've got to say, but like being an international director or a student recruitment person at the moment must be a really difficult job, because the question about growth, I don't think is as much about. I would separate. So back in the day, I would say that demand equaled growth, and so how you say there is increasing demand from Africa, there's no doubt. There is still solid demand from right across South Asia, right across Southeast Asia. and into North Asia. The demand and the forecast demand globally for global student mobility is still forecast to grow. So demand is not the issue. It's not an external force here. When you start talking about growth, there's a couple of things that we need to think about. So I think the visa system is really important. That's being used as a filter at the moment. So if you're, University X and you're wanting to grow by 5%, you've got a couple of things that you need to think about. One is, how do you actually get students through that visa system? And given the fact that there's been such ambiguity around visa decisions, that's a really difficult proposition at the moment. So how you do that is one thing. The second then is, what's your allocation? So if your allocation decreases, how do you quite literally can't grow. You'll be in deficit. And that's a real problem for universities. Now, the way the system's done at the moment is there is possibility still for growth, because the allocations, once you reach 80% of your allocation, you essentially drop down to a slower processing speed.
Yeah.
We've seen in a number of institutions them still go over their allocation, but the for the want of a better word, the retribution or the consequences just haven't really been there. I suspect over the next 6 to 12 months, they will become more real, and it'll be a real challenge for institutions. So again, I think what I would say is that demand no longer equals growth. And interestingly enough, there were 2 research reports that came out yesterday, IDP Emerging Futures 9 and a global benchmark study done by study portals, NAFSA and Oxford Press. Both indicated that essentially, a safe, outcomes generated, like all of those attributes are still there for students. But what they're seeing is that visa predictability is now being brought forward into that primary consideration range. So again, when I talk about demand equals growth, visa processes were always objective. So it was just a hurdle to go through or a thing to move through. Now that's becoming a real consideration in student choice. So I think any country, we're seeing it in New Zealand at the moment. I got a press release this morning that I'll run tomorrow. I think New Zealand's up 11%.
Yes.
And again, that's for having clear, transparent, objective, visa framework. So it's not rocket science to have to grow, but you've got to have the desire to grow. And at the moment, it would appear the Australian government just has no desire in that space.
Yeah. I mean, recently we've seen a lot of these, specifically unis, a lot of colleges expanding to these markets. Right. But then comes the question, and this I've been meaning to ask this for a very long time to a person like you. What about the student experience who comes to Australia? Right. Once they arrive, who's responsible for the experiences? And what are the institutions getting wrong about retention, well-being, and post-arrival journey? I think one of the aspects of this tightening of the visa processes and commissions ban is because there's a lot of hopping from unis to other providers. And I think I feel one of the factors is student retention. What do you think about who's responsible for this kind of experience?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that probably over the last 10 years has moved in different directions at times. I think when as we went into COVID, I think institutions generally were, I don't want to say cutting back intentionally, but were a little bit ambiguous to the student experience from the point of view of really investing in it and seeing a lot of, the nice things that institutions do. And I think about when I was at Murdoch, we used to run pizza nights, we used to run movie nights, we used to do all sorts of things for students to ensure that their engagement with the campus and their experience while studying was a really first-rate one. I suspect that a lot of those things were curtailed over time. They were seen as a cost. Why are we buying these kids pizza once a month? Like, this is silly.
Yeah.
So I think some of those things have probably gone down. I think COVID hit and everyone went off of campus. So budgets got realigned. There wasn't the need necessarily for, on-campus activities or even off-campus activities with, through student clubs or, as an extension of student services. There was probably outreach activity and it was important, but it was done online. It was checking in because people just couldn't even move. COVID comes, COVID leaves, students start coming back. And I think I suspect that a lot of those budgets were decreased. Now, they're institutions that had established programs. When you talk about smaller institutions,
Yeah.
they're different again, right? So you would expect that their social activities are probably a little bit better because they've got smaller cohorts, but some of the higher level student experiences or student services may not even exist because they just don't have no need for that. So the student experience is going to be different depending on where you go. I think now what we're probably experiencing is we've seen the study clusters. So if we think about Study New South Wales, Study Perth, Study Adelaide, they seem to be getting a lot more involved in student experience once students have arrived. Previously, they were always destination marketing bodies. They coordinate people. They would ensure that the message of studying in a particular destination was a really good one. Now we've seen them move more into this student space, and I think that's more about a lot of the research that's gone on. So to say that the student experience is fragmented, because if you go to, I'm not trying to pick on universities and I certainly have no indication of that. If you went to the University of Sydney versus an Ellicott College down in the centre of town versus the University of New England, that student experience is going to be vastly different, and it's going to be engaged different. There's cultures on those campuses that are different, but just the community environment around that is going to be different. So I think these study clusters have done a really good job at being able to ensure that students are welcomed at the airport. Ensure that, and in most states now, there's generally a Lord Mayor's welcome or some sort of government official ceremony to say welcome. And then there's activities throughout the year that these study clusters then work at to essentially build out that student experience. What are we doing really poor at? I think the consistency of it is more than anything. I think it's been really. I think it goes to a point, and sorry, I'm probably off camera here, but as a graph,
that's fine.
Investment in student experience grows as a response to something rather than an investment in this is a good thing. And then once we get to a certain point, and potentially the the quilt surveys are really good, we can say, well, are we investing too much in that now? Maybe we should be investing in something else, and then maybe funding comes off. And so the inconsistency of that, what I'd love to see is and I'm sure that there are institutions out there. So if there are people listening, getting irate with me, I'm sure there are a great number of examples around the country where a great student experience has existed for 10 or 20 years, and they haven't not stopped investing, but certainly the impression on a larger scale is that that's the kind of movement that we've seen.
Yeah, perfect. I think, and Dirk, let me come to the last question of this podcast. So you've seen the ecosystem, you understand the DNA of international education. So I'm going to put it right up to you. If you could sit down tomorrow as an education minister, what are the things that will change in the sector, and what does the sector need?
Yeah, and for those listening, Stan did send me a run sheet, so I was able to prepare for this question because it's a really good question, mate. I would imagine that if I sat down with the Minister for Education tomorrow, I would be tongue-tied and I wouldn't know what to say. But in saying that, I think, look, there needs to be a recognition that international education is important. It's important for students. It's important for the institutions. It's important for government. It's important for small business. And I'd love to see international education be brought more into the mainstream of society and talked about in a really positive way. There's some great success stories. Government at the moment seems to be wanting to pick the one or two or three cases where things have gone wrong and highlight that and give the impression that that's standard practice, and it's not. There are thousands upon hundreds of thousands of fantastic stories of students that have come to this country, obtained degrees. They've either gone home, gone to a third country. We've pushed so hard for the Australian degree to be portable on a global stage. They're our ambassadors. And for those that have stayed, they've gone through our migration system, our point system. They're making genuine contributions to the country. Now, for the few eggs that aren't doing that, they need to be cleaned up, right? If they're doing something illegal, get the federal police involved and give them a good kick up the bum because they need it. But don't concentrate on that. That's the few and far between cases. It's not the general practice. In terms of what else I'd say, Mike Ferguson, who is the Pro Vice Chancellor International at Charles Sturt University, he actually wrote an op-ed for the Koala last week, and it's a bloody good one, mate.
I read it. It's amazing, and that is why I had this idea that this is going to be a good question for Earth now.
So he ends the op-ed with 7 suggestions for government, and I won't read them all, but what I would say is if you get a chance, have a read of that. They all make a lot of sense. in terms of how can we iron out some of the issues that government's trying to solve without having to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But how do we do that in a sensible way? And Mike makes 7 great suggestions there. Evidence levels need to be looked at. Having policies for genuine students just makes sense. If a student wants to change a course and the government thinks that that's not appropriate, let the government make that decision.
Exactly.
And make them apply for a new visa. Put a condition on the visa. That is not a hard thing to do. And given the amount of money they're charging for visas now, there should be plenty of money in the budget to be able to support that sort of thing. How do you sort out these financial issues that we're finding? Mike says maybe escrow accounts.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
If you're having to demonstrate $29,700, I think it is, to come into the country to get a student visa, why not have that deposited into an account that you can draw upon once you get here, and make sure that you've got the finances?
Yeah.
Again, not a hard change if the fraud is as big as what the government is trying to say.
Yeah, Canada does that, so you can do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, these are common sense things that, we don't need to be beating up the entire sector. We don't need to be changing everything every 2 seconds. These are sensible suggestions that can be implemented relatively quickly, one would imagine, and it would help support the sector. And at the moment, it just doesn't feel like that support's there. But yeah, again, if you get a chance, read that. It's a really good piece that Mike put together.
And thank you, Dirk, for bringing that up. For the viewers, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a good slide on the video itself just after the video ends for the podcast. I'm going to put a description. I'm going to put a link in the description itself for people to read. I'm going to put that across on social media. I'm going to tag Dirk and the article itself, so you guys can go read the suggestions up. And we're more than happy to take any questions for Dirk after we stream the podcast. And I think we'll push that across to Dirk. If you have any suggestions to make, if you have any questions that you want Dirk to put across, or put a point or raise a point, please put that across. I will make sure I put that email back to Dirk, and maybe on our request, he will ask the right questions in his own way. Do you have any message for our viewers, Dirk, before we say goodbye to these guys?
Oh, no, just keep at it and enjoy every day you can, because life's way too short. So enjoy it as you can.
Thank you, Dirk. That was amazing. Thank you for being on the podcast. Viewers, the podcast is going to be live by tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Go watch our podcast. Leave us comments. Leave us your suggestions. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this particular podcast. And we'll see you all again on the next podcast. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dirk.
Thank you, Stan. Pleasure to be with you.